Rusty Creek stood in a shallow valley, sandwiched between wooded hills and abandoned mines, a living reminder of an American dream that had long since turned into a nightmare. The town's main street resembled a rotten tooth. A few boarded-up storefronts, the faded sign of the only diner, Donna's, and cracked asphalt that looked as if it hadn't been driven on in years by the highway department. Locals joked that the town's name came not from the creek that once ran through the center, but from the fact that everything here, from hopes to character, was rusty and in disrepair. The town used to live thanks to the American cotton textile mill, but it closed back in the early 2000s, leaving behind only a huge brick building with broken windows on the outskirts. It was now a favorite spot for teenagers who came there to drink stolen beer and dream of one day leaving for good. Most never left. In the spring, Rusty Creek looked especially bleak, the mud from the snowmelt not yet dry, and the stunted trees just beginning to turn a pale green. There was a smell of dampness and something else in the air, a smell of hopelessness that seemed to be absorbed into everything. The walls of the houses, the clothes of the inhabitants, their conversations. Vernon Tucker stood at the window of his house, perched on a hill overlooking the entire town. His sawmill was a little farther away, and from it came the familiar sound of saws and the clatter of logs. In his 48 years, Vernon looked older. Hard work and hardships had not spared him. His once brown hair had long since turned gray at the temples, and deep wrinkles lingered on his face. But in his light gray eyes, you could still see that spark that made him get up every morning and go on. 5 years ago, his life had gone downhill. Maggie, his wife, and Pillar died of cancer after 3 years of fighting. They'd lived together for 22 years, without the children they'd never been able to have, but with a strong and quiet love that had only grown over the years. After her death, the house emptied and filled with a silence that even the television on couldn't dispel. Vernon immersed himself in his work. The sawmill was the only thing keeping him afloat. The 12 employees who depended on him were a reason to get up every morning. He could afford a better life, a bigger house, maybe even move away from Rusty Creek. But why? He was used to his small but good house and to a town where every stone was familiar. Old fool. Vernon often thought to himself in the evenings as he sat on the porch with a bottle of beer. And then there was Haley. He met her at Donna's diner on a cold February day. Vernon came in for coffee and a sandwich, as he did every Friday. He didn't immediately notice the new waitress, a young woman with a lock of blonde hair pulled back into a sloppy ponytail. She smiled at him, and that smile touched something in his long, fossilized heart. Haley Morrow had only been working at the diner for a few weeks. 26 years old, with eyes the color of green bottle glass and a light scattering of freckles on her nose. She served his table and spoke to him casually, not like a wealthy sawmill owner, but like an ordinary person. "Do you always order the same thing, Mr. Tucker?" she asked, pouring his coffee. "How do you know my name?" Vernon wondered. "In a small town like this, it's hard not to know who's who," she shrugged. "Besides, your jacket has Tucker embroidered on it." He looked at his work jacket and grinned. Indeed, the sawmill logo with his last name on it was on the breast pocket. They had only talked for a few minutes that first day, but Vernon caught himself looking forward to the next Friday. And for the first time in a long time, it wasn't work-related. Their romance was developing slowly. Vernon was cautious. He realized he looked ridiculous, an older, life-ruined man infatuated with a younger woman. But Haley seemed genuinely drawn to him. She listened to his stories about the sawmill with interest, laughed at his few jokes, and gradually Vernon began to believe that perhaps there was still room for happiness in his life. When Haley first came to his house, Vernon was as nervous as a teenager. He'd spent the day cleaning and organizing, even bought new curtains for the kitchen, something he hadn't done since Maggie had died. "It's cozy here," Haley said, looking around. "It feels like a real person lives here, not someone trying to pretend to be someone else." Vernon didn't immediately understand what she meant, but he was touched. He cooked dinner, a simple but delicious steak and potatoes, as Maggie had taught him once. They drank wine, talked, and then Haley kissed him herself, and Vernon's world turned upside down. His first night with her had shaken him to his core. Haley's young, supple body, her vanilla-scented skin, her quiet sighs, it all seemed like a dream to Vernon. He looked at her sleeping afterward, in the moonlight streaming through the loose curtains, and couldn't believe his happiness. God, she could be my daughter, he thought, running his finger along the curve of her hip. But then Haley snuggled up to him in her sleep, and all doubt vanished. He proposed 3 months later. It was an impulsive decision. They were walking along abandoned tracks on the outskirts of town, and Haley was talking about her childhood in a trailer park, her father always drunk, and her mother who'd just left one day without saying goodbye. I've always dreamed of a real home, she said, looking away. A place where you are loved and welcomed. And Vernon, looking into her eyes, suddenly realized that he wanted to give her that home. He bought the ring the next day, a simple ring with a small diamond, but Haley cried when he put it on her finger. The news that sawmill owner Vernon Tucker was marrying a young waitress from Donna's Diner had traveled Rusty Creek in a matter of hours. The town was divided into 2 camps, some genuinely happy for Vernon, others maligning him behind his back. The old goat's got himself a young girl, the men in the bar said. She must have gotten his money. Did you see the way she dresses? Whispered women at the counter of the only supermarket. It's clear she's got a crush on him. Lorraine Kenny, proprietress of the Pine Haven Motel and an old friend of Maggie's, was one of the few who dared to voice her concerns directly. Are you sure, Vernon? She asked, running into his office at the sawmill. You've only known each other for 3 months after all. When I met Maggie, I knew she was the one within a week, Vernon answered without taking his eyes off the papers. You were 23 then, Lorraine reminded him. And Maggie was what? Vernon looked up. Different, Lorraine said quietly, and never returned to the conversation. But there were those who were genuinely happy for Vernon. Walter Price, the local sheriff and his old buddy, patted him on the shoulder and said, It's about time, old boy. Maggie wouldn't want you to sit alone in this house for the rest of your life. The wedding took place in early May, when Rusty Creek was beginning to turn green. Vernon insisted on a modest ceremony, just a signing at City Hall and a small reception at his house for those closest to him. I'm not 20 years old enough to have a big celebration, he explained to Haley. And the first time Maggie and I... He paused, but Haley didn't seem offended. She just nodded and said that it was about the 2 of them, not the guests and gifts. On the day of the wedding, Haley was beautiful, in a simple white knee-length dress, bought at a boutique in a neighboring larger town. Her hair was gathered into an elegant bun, and she held a small bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. Vernon, in his new suit, felt clumsy and old around her. But when Haley took his hand and smiled, all doubts went away. About 20 people gathered at the reception at Vernon's house. The sawmill workers, a few of Haley's friends from the diner, Sheriff Price and his wife, Lorraine Kenny. The only one who didn't show up, though he had been invited, was Brent Caulfield, Haley's childhood friend, whom she had often told Vernon about. He's probably at work, Haley shrugged, but Vernon could see the shadow of disappointment in her eyes. The evening passed quietly and peacefully. The guests drank champagne, snacked on canapés prepared by Donna from the diner, and wished the newlyweds happiness. By 9 o'clock, everyone had gone, and Vernon and Haley were alone in the house that was now theirs. Here you go, Mrs. Tucker, Vernon smiled, pulling Haley to him. Welcome home. Haley wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him, and Vernon felt again that wonderful feeling of happiness that her presence gave him. They sat on the porch, finishing the rest of their champagne and looking at the lights of Rusty Creek below. Haley rested her head on Vernon's shoulder and said quietly, You know, I never thought I'd be this happy, especially here in this town. We can leave if you want, Vernon suggested. I could sell the sawmill and we'd... No, Haley shook her head. You love your business and I love this town now, because you're here. They went to bed early. The day had been long and emotional. Haley fell asleep quickly, and Vernon lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathing and thinking about how amazingly his life had turned out. The phone vibrated around midnight. Vernon carefully got out of bed, trying not to wake Haley, and walked out into the hallway. On the screen was a notification of a new message from an unknown number. Vernon opened it. expecting to see a greeting from someone he knew. But it wasn't a greeting, it was a picture. It showed Haley standing in the arms of a young man Vernon recognized Brent Caulfield from the pictures Haley had shown him. They were kissing in the park, in front of an abandoned carousel that stood on the outskirts of Rusty Creek. Judging by the clothes, the photo had been taken recently, probably a day or two before the wedding, because Haley's new blouse had been purchased along with her wedding dress. Underneath the photo was a short message. "She's been with him all these years. You're just a wallet to them, old man." Vernon stared at the screen, feeling the ground go from under his feet. His throat was dry and his heart was pounding so hard he thought it was about to jump out of his chest. He went back into the bedroom and looked at Haley sleeping so beautiful, so young, and so far away from him. And so far away from him. Was it all a lie? The thought pierced his mind with a sharp pain. He walked back into the hallway and looked at the photograph again, taking in every detail. It was definitely Haley, and it was definitely Brent, and they were kissing the way people who have a long, deep connection kiss. Vernon sank to the floor with his back against the wall and covered his face with his hands. The first day of their marriage wasn't over yet, and his world was already falling apart. The morning of their first day together as husband and wife was gray and chilly, and Vernon didn't sleep a wink until dawn, sitting in the living room chair, replaying over and over in his head the picture he'd seen of Haley and Brent entwined in an embrace. Their lips joined in a kiss that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Every time he closed his eyes, the picture popped up in front of him with excruciating clarity. When Haley woke up and went down to the kitchen, Vernon was already sitting at the table with a cup of cold coffee. He forced himself to smile as she kissed his cheek and said cheerfully, "Good morning, husband." She was so beautiful in his old shirt, which reached her mid-thigh with her hair disheveled from sleep. For a moment, Vernon almost believed the picture was a fake, a wicked joke by someone jealous. But then he noticed Haley glance at her phone and the coldness spilled back into his chest. "Do you have plans for tonight?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "I was going to stop by Donna's to pick up some things from the locker room." Haley poured herself a cup of coffee. "And then maybe go shopping. We need some new towels." Vernon nodded, fighting the urge to grab her by the shoulders and demand the truth. Dozens of scenarios ran through his mind. Shout out the accusations right now, demand an explanation, or pretend to know nothing but secretly follow her. The thought of revenge came unbidden, like the fog from the hills to Rusty Creek. A light haze at first, and then already a thick shroud covering everything around. They used it, laughing, probably behind his back, planned to rip him off. And then what, fake an accident? He'd heard of such stories. Young wives and their lovers getting rid of their elderly husbands for the inheritance. No, he won't let them win, wouldn't let them humiliate themselves further. "I'll be late tonight," Vernon said, rising from the table. "I've got to deal with supplies at the sawmill." "Do you have to work?" Haley pouted. "We're on our honeymoon." "Honeymoon?" he echoed in his head. How bitter that phrase sounded now. "Just a couple hours," he promised. And then, gathering his will in his fist, kissed her on the forehead. "I'll cook something special tonight." When he left the house, Vernon got into his old pickup truck, but he didn't drive to the sawmill. Instead, he parked at the opposite end of the street, where he had a good view of their house, and waited. Waiting brought back memories. Moments that had seemed insignificant then, but now took on an ominous meaning. Like the one time he'd come to Haley's diner and found her talking animatedly with Brent at the back door. They were standing very close together, and Brent was hotly arguing something to her. When she saw Vernon, Haley instantly pulled away and waved to him, and Brent disappeared around the corner. "Just an old friend," Haley explained then. "He and I grew up in the same trailer park." Or the night she'd gotten the text, looked at her phone screen, and suddenly said she had to check on a sick friend. She'd returned 3 hours later, smelling of cigarettes and cheap beer. Smells he associated with the Last Hope bar where Brent often hung out. And Brent at their wedding, or rather, his absence. "He's probably at work," Haley had said then. But Vernon knew that Brent had lost his job as a mechanic at the gas station months ago. Haley had told him about it once herself, and then seemed to have forgotten. An hour after Vernon left, Haley came out of the house. She was dressed in skinny jeans and a low-cut blouse, an outfit that seemed too dressy for a trip to the diner to pick things up. Vernon watched as she got into the old Ford he'd given her shortly after their engagement and drove off in the direction of downtown. He waited a few minutes and followed her, keeping a safe distance. In a small town where everyone knew his pickup truck, following was a risky business, but Vernon knew he had to see things for himself. Haley didn't go to the diner. Instead, she headed toward an old, abandoned park on the outskirts of town, the same one where the photo from the anonymous tip had been taken. Vernon parked behind a dilapidated movie theater and, ducking down, followed her on foot. Brent was already waiting for her at the carousel. He was sitting on a peeling horse, smoking a cigarette, and jumped up when he saw Haley approaching. They didn't rush into each other's arms as Vernon had expected, but instead, tension seemed to hang between them. Vernon crept closer, taking cover behind an old ice cream stand, and strained his hearing. "Are you out of your mind? Dating here?" Brent's voice sounded annoyed. "Half the town knows this is our place." "What was I supposed to do?" Haley snapped at him. "You weren't answering your cell phone." "I've been busy." Brent tossed the cigarette butt away. "Is he acting weird? Does he suspect something? Are you sure?" "I don't know." Haley looked around nervously. "He didn't say anything like that, but he's been acting weird. I think he suspects something." "We need to move faster." Brent lowered his voice, and Vernon had to strain his hearing even more. "How much longer are you going to stall? A month? 2? A year?" "I told you I need time." Haley crossed her arms over her chest. "The will, remember? He has to change it." "We don't have time," Brent cut him off. "I owe serious people, Haley. They won't wait for the old man to rewrite his papers." They argued some more, and then Brent suddenly drew Haley to him and kissed her with such passion that Vernon's breath caught. She resisted at first, but then responded by wrapping her arms around his neck. "Let's go to your place," Brent said hoarsely. "I'm going crazy without you." "No, not your place." Haley shook her head. "Your motel's on the other side of town. They might see us. Let's go that way." She nodded toward the park's abandoned ticket office, a small wooden structure with boarded-up windows. Brent nodded, and the two of them, holding hands, headed that way. Vernon didn't follow them. He'd seen enough already. His legs were shaking and there was a metallic taste in his mouth. This was even worse than he thought. They weren't just laughing at him behind his back, they were planning to rip him off, maybe even kill him. Instead of heading back to his car, he headed toward the Pine Haven Motel. He needed to talk to the one person he felt was on his side, Lorraine Kenny. Lorraine immediately knew something was wrong as soon as she saw Vernon's face. She dragged him into the staff room and, seating him in a chair, poured whiskey from a stashed bottle. "Tell me," she commanded briefly. And Vernon told her everything about the photograph, about the conversation he'd overheard, about how Haley and Brent had hidden in the abandoned booth. Lorraine listened without interrupting, only shaking her head and occasionally topping up his whiskey. When he finished, she was silent for a long time, and then she said, "Leave her, Vernon. Tonight. Get her out of your house." "And then what?" Vernon grinned bitterly. "The whole town will laugh at me. An old fool who's been fooled by a young girl. Better to be laughed at than mourned," Lorraine said stiffly. "Those two are dangerous, Vernon. If they're planning to get your money, who knows what they're capable of." But Vernon wasn't listening. A plan had matured in his mind, simple and frightening at the same time. If they wanted to destroy him, he would strike first. He would not put up with humiliation. He would not fall victim to other people's intrigues. He would take revenge so that no one would ever know the truth. "Lorraine," he interrupted her, "do you still have contacts for that herbalist in the next town over? The one who helped you and Maggie when she was in a lot of pain?" Lorraine looked at him with sudden understanding and horror. "Vernon, no, that's insane. You don't... I just want to talk to him," Vernon lied. "Maybe he knows a good sedative. I need to get my thoughts in order." Lorraine didn't believe him, but after much coaxing, she gave him the number in her squeaky handwriting on a piece of paper. "Don't do anything stupid, Vernon," she warned him. "It's not worth it." But Vernon had already made up his mind. Gathering herbs from the old herbalist's recipe in the woods behind the sawmill that afternoon, He felt a wonderful calm. It was as if everything had finally fallen into place. The mixture was simple. A few plants that were harmless apart, but together created a powerful toxin that left no trace in the body. Natural death, the old man said over the phone. The heart just stops beating. No forensics will show anything. Vernon paid him $300 cash for the prescription and another $100 for his silence. When he got home that evening, Haley was already there. She had showered and changed into a homemade dress, as if she hadn't spent the afternoon in her lover's arms. There was a bottle of wine and 2 glasses on the kitchen table. I decided to start without you, she smiled, raising her glass. Did you promise something special for dinner? Yes, Vernon nodded, taking off his jacket. Special. He prepared dinner, moving through the kitchen with unusual grace and concentration. Haley sat at the table, recounting her day, not a word about Brent, not a hint of their meeting. She lied so naturally that if Vernon didn't know the truth, he would have believed every word. The special drink he'd made was mulled wine according to his grandmother's recipe, with orange, cinnamon, cloves, and honey, and with the addition of a special herbal mixture that he had carefully ground and dissolved in wine. The smell of the spices completely masked any extraneous flavor. This smells divine. Haley inhaled the aroma with pleasure as Vernon placed the steaming glass in front of her. What is it? Mulled wine, Vernon replied, pouring one for himself as well. In fact, his glass was just a heated mixture of juice and wine, no lethal addition. An old family recipe, suitable for special occasions. And tonight's special occasion? Haley looked at him playfully. The most special, Vernon raised his glass. To us. Haley took a big sip and exhaled in satisfaction. It's delicious, a little bitter, but it was pleasant. Vernon watched her, feeling strangely calm. They ate dinner, talking, and Haley finished her glass. Vernon offered her another and she didn't refuse. The first signs came about half an hour later. Haley suddenly turned pale and ran her hand over her forehead. I don't feel so good, she said. I feel dizzy. Maybe the wine's too strong, Vernon suggested, watching her closely. Come on, I'll help you to the bed. He supported her as she staggered to get up from the table. Her skin was cold and damp to the touch. Haley took a few steps and then bent in half from the sudden pain. What's wrong with me? There was fear in her voice. Vernon, I don't feel well. It's going to be okay, he said soothingly, supporting her. Just lie down. But Haley was already starting to shake. She pulled out of his arms and staggered to her purse. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her cell phone and, breathing heavily, began dialing. Who are you calling? Vernon asked, though he already knew the answer. Yeah, I need a doctor, Haley said with difficulty, but Vernon saw the name Brent on the screen. He walked over and gently took the phone from her. Brent? He asked quietly. Do you think he'll help? The incomprehension in Haley's eyes was quickly replaced by realization and horror. You know? Vernon nodded, surprised at his own calm. I know, about everything. Your money plan, your meetings, all your dirty little secrets. Haley staggered and fell to her knees, clutching her stomach. Her eyes widened with pain and fear. Vernon, please, I don't... She coughed and foam appeared on her lips. You didn't what? You didn't mean to kill me? Vernon sat down next to her. Just strip me clean and run off with your boyfriend? How noble. We didn't... She was struggling with every word. I love you. You... Vernon laughed. A dry, barking laugh he didn't recognize himself. Of course you do, especially my money. Haley tried to crawl to the door, but her strength was rapidly leaving her. Her movements were becoming more and more erratic, and there was blood on her lips. Help, she whispered, reaching out to him. Help. Vernon shook his head. How are you going to help me? Weed and take my money with Brent? Haley's pupils dilated. She twitched convulsively and fell silent. Her eyes remained open, but there was no more life in them. Vernon sat beside her for a few minutes, feeling a strange emptiness inside. Then he slowly lifted her lifeless body, closed her eyes, and carried her to the bed. Laying Haley down and covering her with a blanket, He sat beside her and sat like that all night, looking at her face, which in death seemed so young and innocent. In the morning, as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the bedroom, he dialed Sheriff Price's number. "Walter," he said in a trembling voice, "get over here as soon as you can. Something's happened to Haley. She's not breathing." Sheriff Walter Price arrived at Vernon's house 15 minutes after the call, with his blinker on but no siren. News traveled faster than police signals in Rusty Creek. By the time he turned off the engine of his company SUV, several neighbors were already looking out of their windows and off the porches of their homes. Vernon met him on the doorstep, pale, red-eyed, and with trembling hands. His shirt was half unbuttoned, stained with wine-like stains. He looked exactly as a man who has just lost his young wife should look. "She's upstairs," Vernon said in a husky voice. "I woke up and she's not breathing, Walt. She ain't breathing." The sheriff made his way into the house, climbed the stairs, and entered the bedroom. Haley was lying on the bed, covered to the shoulders with a blanket, eyes closed. If it weren't for the waxy pallor of her face, you'd think she was just sleeping. Walter moved closer, checked for a pulse, even though he already knew he wouldn't find one. Her body was cold. "When did you find her?" he asked without turning around. "About an hour ago." Vernon stood in the doorway, leaning against the jamb as if his legs wouldn't hold him up. "I fell asleep in the chair downstairs after supper, and she went to bed. Got up in the morning and she—" His voice trailed off. The sheriff nodded and continued to look around the room. No sign of a struggle, no sign of forced entry. There was an empty glass and a bottle of water on the nightstand by the bed. Haley was dressed in a nightgown, her hair neatly combed. "Did she complain about anything last night?" Sheriff asked. "Headache, nausea?" Vernon hesitated for a moment, as if remembering. "Yeah, she said she was a little dizzy," he finally answered. "But we had some wine at dinner, and I thought it was from the alcohol." Sheriff Price had been a policeman for 27 years, 15 of them as sheriff of Rusty Creek. In that time, he had seen a lot of deaths, from accidents and murders to suicides and overdoses. Years of service have taught him one thing. It often looks natural on the surface, but you have to dig deeper. "I need to call the medics, Vernon," he said, "and we may have to do an autopsy." Vernon just nodded, looking at the breathless body of his young wife. "Do what you have to do, Walt," he said. "I just want to know what happened." There was genuine grief in his voice. The sheriff put his hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, friend," he said. "I know how much you've been looking forward to this marriage." Vernon looked at the sheriff with devastated eyes that showed immense weariness. "It's fate, I guess," he said quietly. "I don't deserve happiness." 3 hours later, Vernon's house was full of people. The paramedics who'd taken Haley's body away, the policemen from the next town to help with the paperwork, and the nosy neighbors the sheriff had turned out of the door. But they were still gathered on the front lawn, exchanging whispers and speculation. Vernon sat in the kitchen, clutching a mug of long cold coffee in his hands. He answered the sheriff's questions in a mechanical, lifeless voice. "Yes, we had dinner together. Family recipe mulled wine and steaks." "No, she didn't say anything unusual." "Yes, she seemed happy." "No, she didn't have any enemies. At least I didn't know of any." His face remained almost impassive, like a mask. Only sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, did his gaze become absent, like he was somewhere far away from here. Sheriff Price had known Vernon for 30 years. They'd fished together, hunted together. He'd been to his first wedding and Maggie's funeral. If anyone else had told him that Vernon Tucker might have killed his wife, Walter would have laughed in his face. And yet, something about Vernon's behavior bothered the sheriff. His grief seemed genuine, but there was something else about it, some strange humility, as if Vernon wasn't surprised by Haley's death. The kitchen door swung open, and Brent Caulfield flew into the house. His eyes were wild, his hair disheveled, and he reeked of booze. "Where is she?" he shouted, looking around. "Where's Haley?" Sheriff Price came up and stood between Brent and Vernon. "Calm down, Brent," he said firmly. "Haley's been taken to the county center morgue. What happened to her?" Brent kept his eyes on Vernon. "What did you do to her, old man?" Vernon slowly raised his gaze to Brent. Their eyes met, and for a moment the room was so quiet you could hear the water dripping from the loose faucet. "I didn't do anything to her," Vernon answered calmly. "She died in her sleep. The doctors say it was probably heart failure." "Bullshit." Brent stepped forward, but the sheriff held him back. "She was 26 years old. She couldn't have heart trouble." "How can you be so sure?" the sheriff intervened. "Are you her doctor?" "I'm her friend," Brent blurted out. "Her best friend since she was a kid. I've known her all her life." "That's interesting," the sheriff said thoughtfully. "You didn't go to your best friend's wedding." Brent looked confused for a moment, then clenched his fists. "I was busy. I had things to do." "What business could be more important than your best friend's wedding?" The sheriff continued to press. "And how did you know about Haley's death? I hadn't made an official statement yet." Brent went pale. "I got a call from Donna at the diner," he muttered. "News travels fast in this town." The sheriff nodded, but there was suspicion in his eyes. He made a mental note to verify that information. "I think you'd better leave, Brent," he said. "Vernon just lost his wife. He needs space." "He did something to her," Brent insisted, retreating toward the door under pressure from the sheriff. "I know it." As the door closed behind Brent, Vernon sighed heavily. "He's drunk," he said. "Don't mind him." But Sheriff Price was already thinking. Brent's reaction wasn't just a friend's reaction to loss. It was the reaction of a man who had lost something much greater. And the fear in his eyes was not just the fear of death. Toward evening, another visitor showed up at Vernon's house, Lorraine Kenny. She brought a casserole, as was the custom at Rusty Creek in case of tragedy, and a bottle of good whiskey. "How are you, Vernon?" she asked, sitting down across from him at the kitchen table. Sheriff Price, who was still in the house, noticed some strange look flashed between them. Quick, barely perceptible, but significant. "I'm hanging in there," Vernon answered. "Walt thinks I should testify at the station." "Right now?" Lorraine turned to the sheriff. "Really, Walter? The man just lost his wife. Give him at least a day to recover." "It's just a formality," the sheriff explained. "We need to document the details while the memory is fresh." "Details of what?" Lorraine asked sharply. "Natural death, or do you suspect criminality every time someone dies now?" Sheriff Price looked at Lorraine carefully. Her defensive reaction seemed odd. Before he could answer, there was another knock on the door. Jacob Miller, a deputy sheriff, stood on the doorstep. "Boss, can I talk to you for a minute?" he called out. They stepped out onto the porch where Jacob lowered his voice. "I found something interesting," he said. Brent Caulfield owed a large sum to a guy in the county seat, played cards and lost over 10 grand. They gave him until the end of the month to pay it off. The sheriff rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Also," Jacob continued, "I've been interviewing some of the residents. Rumor has it that Haley and Brent used to meet at the old park on a regular basis. And according to them, the meetings weren't exactly friendly. They were seen there yesterday, too." A picture began to form in the sheriff's mind. He returned to the kitchen, where Lorraine was talking quietly to Vernon. "Vernon," the sheriff began, "did you know that Haley met with Brent yesterday?" Vernon froze, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," he answered. "She said she wanted to pick up some things she'd left at his place a long time ago. They grew up together, didn't they? And that didn't bother you?" The sheriff watched Vernon's reaction carefully. "Why should it bother me?" Vernon shrugged. "I trusted my wife." The sheriff noticed Lorraine tense slightly at those words. "Vernon," he began softly, "perhaps there's something you're not telling me." There was a long pause. Vernon stared into the space in front of him as if he saw something there that was inaccessible to others. Then he looked up at the sheriff, and something new flashed in his eyes, a determination. "There is something," he confessed. "The night before the wedding, I got a text message with a picture. It showed Haley and Brent kissing in the park." The sheriff straightened up. "Did you save that message?" Vernon shook his head. "Deleted it. Figured someone was just trying to ruin our happiness." "Who sent the message?" "It was an unfamiliar number." Vernon spread his hands. "I didn't think much of it." Lorraine suddenly intervened. "Walter, why all the questions? Vernon just lost his wife and you're interrogating him like a suspect." "I'm just gathering information, Lorraine," the sheriff replied. "That's my job. Your job is to protect the people of this town, not torture them when they're in grief." Lorraine parried. Sheriff Price looked at her carefully. Something about her demeanor seemed unnatural, too contrived. He turned back to Vernon. "Did you know about Brent's debts? $10,000 is a lot of money for our town." Vernon shook his head slowly. Haley hadn't said anything about it. "And yesterday, after the wedding, did you notice anything strange about her?" The sheriff went on. "Maybe she was nervous, distracted." "She seemed happy." Vernon stared off into space again. "We drank champagne, ate dinner, talked about the future." His voice shook, and he fell silent. Something in his eyes changed, as if a shadow had flashed there. "Vernon, I think we need to talk privately," the sheriff said firmly. "No," Lorraine interjected. "I'm not leaving him now." "It's all right, Lorraine," Vernon said, suddenly calm. "I've got to tell the truth." Lorraine turned sharply pale. "Vernon, you don't have to." "I have to," he said firmly. "I can't go on." He turned to the sheriff. "I knew about them," he said. "Not just from the message. I saw them in the park yesterday, followed them." Sheriff Price sat across from Vernon, listening intently. "They were planning something," Vernon continued. "Brent talked about money, about time being short. Haley mentioned the will." "You overheard them talking?" the sheriff clarified. Vernon nodded. "And what did you do afterward?" "Nothing." Vernon looked the sheriff straight in the eye. "Came home and cooked dinner. We drank mulled wine, talked, and Haley went to bed. I stayed downstairs in the chair, and in the morning, I found her dead." His story sounded plausible, but the sheriff sensed something was wrong. He turned to Lorraine, who sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her face tense. "Lorraine," he began, "is there something you want to say?" She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw an agonizing struggle. "It was I who sent the message," she admitted quietly. "Ia." There was silence. Vernon slowly turned his head toward her, his face expressing no surprise, only weariness. "Why?" the sheriff asked. "Because she used him," Lorraine straightened up. Everyone knew about it, but no one wanted to talk. Haley and Brent were planning to bilk him out of his money. I couldn't let that happen. Not after Maggie, not after everything he'd been through. "You knew he was following them," the sheriff stated. "You knew and you didn't say anything." "I was hoping he'd just divorce her." Lorraine shook her head. "I didn't think he'd—" She stopped and looked at Vernon. He was sitting still, his face calm, almost peaceful. "What did he— what?" The sheriff shifted his gaze from one to the other. "That he would snap," Lorraine finished. Sheriff Price felt a chill run down his spine. "Vernon," he said quietly, "what happened last night?" Vernon looked at his hands, the hands of a lumberjack, strong, calloused from years of hard work, hands that could create and destroy. "I didn't want this," he whispered. "When I saw them together, something inside me broke. I remembered an old recipe, an herbal concoction. My grandfather used to use it to hunt wolves." Sheriff Price exhaled slowly. Lorraine closed her eyes. "I put it in the mulled wine," Vernon continued, his voice sounding detached, as if he were telling someone else's story. "She didn't suspect a thing. She drank it and we went on talking, and then she felt sick and reached for the phone. I saw that she wasn't calling an ambulance, she was calling Brent, and, I didn't help her." His eyes filled with tears. "I watched her die, and I felt relieved." There was silence in the room. Sheriff Price realized he had just heard a confession of murder, from a man he'd known all his life, from a man he trusted. "Vernon Tucker, you are under arrest for the murder of Haley Tucker," he said in an official tone. "You have the right to remain silent." While the sheriff read the rights, Vernon sat as still as a stone. Only when the handcuffs snapped on his wrists did he seem to realize the reality of what was happening. "I'm going crazy, Walt," he whispered. "Ever since it happened, I've been hearing her voice. I've seen her everywhere. She's watching me from every corner." Sheriff Price had seen many arrests in his career, but never had his heart been so heavy as at this moment. "Come on, Vernon," he said quietly. "Let's go." Lorraine gave them a glance, then sank back in her chair and covered her face with her hands. The news that Vernon Tucker had poisoned his young wife had shaken Rusty Creek to its foundations. The small town, where nothing like this had ever happened, was suddenly at the center of a real drama. People gathered in groups on the streets, at the Last Hope Bar, at Donna's Diner, discussing every detail. Brent Caulfield had disappeared from town 2 days after Vernon's arrest. They said he'd gone to Nevada, away from his creditors and the memories of Haley. Lorraine Kenny closed the motel and put it up for sale. When Sheriff Price asked her why, she replied simply, "Too many ghosts." Vernon's sawmill continued to operate. His foreman took it over so that 12 men wouldn't be out of work, but everyone knew it wouldn't last long without Vernon. Vernon himself pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He did not contest the sentence, nor did he ask for leniency. As Sheriff Price said, Vernon seemed almost grateful to be removed from a home where every corner reminded him of what he had done. In jail, Vernon began to write long, rambling letters addressed to Haley. In them, he apologized, accused her of betrayal, and told her of his love. A prison psychiatrist diagnosed him as psychotic. Vernon claimed to see Haley every night. She sits on the edge of his bunk and looks at him with the same smile she once used to serve his table at the diner. A year after the tragedy, the lights come back on in Vernon's house on the hill. The new owners, a young couple from the big city, decided to turn it into a guest house. They didn't know the history of the place, hadn't heard of Vernon and Haley, of Brent and Lorraine, of betrayal and revenge. To them, it was just a beautiful house overlooking the valley. But the people of Rusty Creek knew. They eyed the house warily, whispering, telling each other that sometimes on particularly quiet nights, the sound of breaking glass and women's cries came from there. Rusty Creek continued to live its slow, unhurried life. People were born and died, fell in love and broke up, dreamed and disappointed. But the story of Vernon and Haley became part of the folklore of this small town, a warning about how easily love can turn to hate and trust to betrayal. And perhaps the most frightening lesson for the people of Rusty Creek was the realization that even the most ordinary people you've known all your life can harbor dark depths that can consume not only them, but everyone around them.